So we have been recording our webinars. Those of you who've been on them before will know that they are posted post-event onto our YouTube channel. So this will happen with this session as well. So if there's anything you wish to sort of go back onto, you can access it there along with the previous webinars that we've shown. And since really starting these events post-lockdown, we've aimed to give learning and support in areas probably outside of the normal clinical areas of the sort of lockdown and COVID subjects. And we started our journey back in April with Dan Owens, who gave us some top tips on using social media more to communicate with our customers during the early part of the pandemic. Then in May, during Mental Health Awareness Week, Sheena Tanishar helped us to understand some of the important facts of and hints on using well-being in everyday life. That was booked long before COVID hit us, and who knew then that in 2019, when we booked it, it would perhaps be as relevant as it was at that time. And then last month, Joe Cowling took us further down our road, offering us 3 ways to manage behavioural changes and resistance to change facing individuals in practice, as well as teams, and of course the impact on our patients too. So this is part of our journey and continues. So I'm going to be very pleased to introduce David Shackhead. David's a positive transformation leader. He helps individuals, groups and organisations to achieve positive change through flexible, creative and practical use of strength-based approaches to change. He supports his clients in thinking differently, in unlocking possibilities, creating inspiring visions for the future and finding ways to work forward, no matter how difficult that situation may seem. And I think it's probably fair to say that the situation that we've been through over the last few months, and actually continue to being it, is a difficult one. So please do use the Q&A function. It gives me great pleasure now to hand over to David. David, if you'd just like to show yourself, and we shall start the seminar in full.
Great, thank you very much, Neil. Thank you.
There we are.
And thank you everyone for joining us. I'm absolutely delighted to speak with you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is storytelling, and in particular storytelling in the context that you are of reopening and practicing with confidence and really jumpstarting after such a difficult period of lockdown. So let's first of all, let me tell you a little bit just about my background so that you know who am I and how have I arrived at this webinar. I've had 20 years plus of really working with organizations, with teams, with projects on changing things, on solving problems, on developing people, and driving change overall. In the past 13 years or so, I've been practicing predominantly kind of practice that is called strength-based change, working with people's strengths, with people's passions, with people's interests, and of course their stories. Part of that journey, I've published 2 books, but they're not particularly relevant for the topic of tonight. It's just an achievement that I'm proud of. And a little bit for my personal life. I love traveling, I love swimming, going to the theater. But of course, with the COVID-19 period and the lockdown, none of that is possible at the moment. So instead, I've discovered some new passions. One of them is creating art on pieces of wood, which might be a bit random. But I also discovered my abilities in the world of DIY, which was completely foreign to me beforehand. So there you go. That's how I use my free time during the lockdown. I think more interesting to that, actually, before I go there, just if you're wondering about my accent, it's an interesting mix from different places. I was born and raised in Israel, a place nobody heard of, I'm sure. And then I moved to another little known place, which is Texas in the US. And from there I moved to Scotland. And in the last 15 years I've lived in London. So if you're trying to track my accent, I think it's quite confusing to mix a Texan accent, a Scottish accent, and a London accent with my original Israeli accent. But that's about me. Let me tell you a little bit more about my storytelling journey, because I think that's more relevant to the topic of tonight. So in my early career, I was very much into problem solving and driving change in a very data-driven approach. For some of you who might be familiar, the approaches were called Lean Thinking, Six Sigma, but you really don't need to know much about it for tonight. I was working very much on projects that are designed to drive business improvement. And at that time, I had a very strong belief that in order to drive change, I need to collect data, I need to make sense of the data, and from that, drive the action. In 2006, I just came across very randomly a book that really changed my perspective. And the book title was already quite provocative. And it was Wake Me Up When the Data is Over. I was quite intrigued by that title because what do you mean the data is over? Data is my life. And the book itself was very, very interesting because it was really sharing a lot of different stories on how different organizations were using storytelling to drive business, to drive their actions, to engage their employees, to engage customers and clients and communities, and even employees that wanted to join the company. That was a really refreshing view of change from where I came. A couple of years later, I was discovered the main strength-based activity that I do today, which is appreciative inquiry. And appreciative inquiry is a practice that put a lot of emphasis on people's stories, really getting the best stories we have and learning from them and using them for change. Another aspect of that is from my coaching work, which you'll see here, I'm paying a lot of attention to the stories I hear. People tell a lot of very confused stories, and through the approaches that I use, I help them make sense of that story and actually find the more inspiring parts of it. One of my own strengths, which I discovered along this journey of the last 15 years, is actually storytelling. And that's from a tool called Realize 2. It's actually helping you find your strengths. And storytelling, I discovered, was one of my unrealized strengths. It was a strength I had that I wasn't actually using as much as I could. So that drove also more personal attention on storytelling. But I think I'd like to tell you one thing about one story that really marked the power of storytelling in my mind, and that's the London 2012 story. But in order to tell that story, I will actually go back to my personal side of it, which began in 2005. In fact, it was the 6th of July 2005, and that was the date I had moved from Edinburgh to London. So basically changed jobs and moved from one city to another. And I was actually reminded of that date this week because it marked the slides are not visible. Right. Hopefully that will solve the problem. Okay, back to my story. So, July 2005, that's the beginning of July, I moved from Edinburgh to London. And at that point in time, what happened that day was actually that night, the Olympics Committee announced that London was going to host the 2012 Olympics. And I remember that day, of course, because of my personal move to London. It felt a very exciting moment for London. That night, people were actually celebrating all around London the announcement, especially the announcement that London beat Paris. And it was quite a happy evening in London that night. And I personally was quite excited because that was my first day in London. The next day, 7/7 happened. And we all know what happened that day. I don't need to tell you more about that. But it was quite a sharp transition from such a happy city to a shocked and sad city. And it was from one day to another, it happened. And what happened afterward was a lot of stories about obviously terrorism and the problems and the security issues in a big city of London. And that created a whole interesting twist to the London 2012 story because it created the fear, the concern about security issues and how would they affect the London 2012 games. I'll move a bit further. 2008, we had the financial crisis in London, and all of a sudden a new flavor of the story was added, and the story now became the story of money, or in fact lack of money, and how budgets are tight and how austerity is going to hit all of us. And now it was a combination of both fear of security issues as well as concerns about budgets. All of that was affecting the preparation for the Olympics Games, and it was getting worse and worse, and the reporting in the news and the stories we were hearing were quite negative. So now I'll move forward to the actual games, and I remember that week in London because the first week in that, especially the day of the opening of the games, the city was almost empty because it was quite a strong sense that if you really don't have to go anywhere in London, better avoid it. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew what will happen. There was fear of attacks. There was fear of the infrastructure, transportation not being able to cope with all that. A lot of concerns, and so many people chose not to arrive and not to get to London if they didn't have to. Then the game starts. We had a fantastic opening ceremony. We had a great beginning to the games. The first week was happening. Everything just went smoothly without any issues. In fact, many points of the Olympics were praised for how well they did. So what was interesting to notice for me was after about a week where we were hearing constantly stories of success, stories of achievement, and not just, by the way, just the British Olympics, but also many sports men and women who were able to achieve phenomenal achievements. All we heard in the news was how successful everything and everyone was. This was going on for 3 weeks of the games, but the transition in London was very visible after about a week. Suddenly people went out and celebrated and sat in the pubs and in the restaurants, and the stories we were hearing around were very different. After the 3 weeks of the games, we started with the Paralympics. And I think the Paralympics actually made a huge difference because this was the very first time that the Paralympic Games received as much attention as the actual games. And again, we had an injection of good stories of success, of spectacular achievements, despite the difficulties and the handicaps that people were coping with. And overall, we had 6 weeks of great stories and pride in how well those games were run and set up and executed without any hitch or problems. So that's all great. Nice story. I have my own personal angle to it. But what I did notice afterwards, which very few people paid attention to, is that about 6 months after those games, the economy changed. The whole economy of the whole UK, not just England. The economy completely shifted from a recession kind of situation to growth, and to actually quite significant growth. And so for me, this was a real signal of how a change in the stories we tell to each other and the stories we hear in the media can actually affect the economy, can affect people's lives and prosperity as a result of that. It doesn't happen immediately, but it has a huge impact. So for me, this was a turning point in understanding the power of storytelling. And I hope that now that you hear my story from that, you can also recall some of those moments for you personally. So that's my storytelling journey. But let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. And it will start by covering a little bit about what is storytelling. So a little bit of the theory around that. We're going to share a story of one of an IQ practitioner here tonight, which would make it more personal to your environment. Hopefully you'll get some fresh ideas from that, and then we'll do a bit of reflection on your own stories. Each and every one of us has a story of lockdown and the reopening. And I hope to give you some useful tools in this journey. Please keep your questions to the very end. I'm very happy to answer them. And if we don't have time tonight to answer all of those questions, I will answer them in follow-up email. Unless there is an urgent question that you need to answer for. So let's start. Let's start with storytelling. What is it and why is it important? First of all, I see storytelling as both an art and a craft. It does have some science to it, which I will cover with you. But ultimately, it's art. It's your style. It's your story that actually drives the actual science of storytelling and how it plays out in your life and your practice. It creates, as art, it requires creativity. It requires your own vision, your own skill, your own practice. It's not something that you will totally get through in this webinar or just by taking a course. But the more you practice it, the more at ease you are with storytelling, and the more you will see the power of it for your practice. And there will be some trial and error in this, because it is, how do you learn? You learn by what works and what doesn't work. So the more you try it, the more you will see how you get better at it. First of all, as human beings, we are storytelling machines. And for many of us, that may not be as obvious. The image you see here on the slide is taken from cave drawings by Aboriginal people in Australia, and that was drawn 35,000 years ago. So even then, people were telling stories to each other. This really, of course, depicts some stories, early stories of living in Australia. I like this definition, storytelling machines. We tell stories, we listen to stories, and we use stories to understand, make sense of our lives, to connect with people, to remember facts, and develop ourselves and achieve different things. And in fact, it's almost 65% of our interactions between people is actually in the form of stories. And it can be formal stories, it can be sharing legends and books, and it can also be just gossip. Gossip is also a form of storytelling. So it ranges, it has a huge range, and here are some examples for that. I'm sure all of you have seen the Cinderella or familiar with that, or Harry Potter. We know the news, the BBC News, for example, shares stories every night. Shakespeare, of course, movies from Hollywood, and even our religion, whatever religion we believe in, if we believe in a religion, and the history we carry is story. There are many, many stories that we carry for ourselves to explain who we are and where we come from. There are stories that are representative of a group that we belong to, or a community that we belong to. And of course, those stories help us feel that we belong to some group or some community, but also differentiate us from another group or another community. Stories are shared in theaters and movies, documentaries, and also in therapy to help people through difficulties they have in their lives. But what is interesting for me and also relevant for the topic of tonight is how stories are used in the world of business and in marketing and advertising. And I think one great example that I particularly like is the story of Compare the Meerkat, which actually was a whole story that was created by, of course, Compare the Market, as a way to show a fun and light side to something that can be quite boring, actually, comparing the prices of insurance policies or utility providers. They actually created a whole story that was running in parallel to the actual use of the tool of Compare the Market. And for me, it's quite a very creative, very engaging way of using storytelling to market your services. There are broadly 7 types of stories, and I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. Some stories about overcoming some threat or some monster. Stories about how someone with a very modest background became rich and successful. Quest, some adventure. stories of rebirth as a new person, as a new way of life, stories of comedies, and of course some tragic stories. All of them are present, and these are the different types of stories, and I'll give you some examples here. I'm sure you've seen many of them. And hopefully this also helps you start to maybe think about your own story of the lockdown and the reopening, and what sort of story it might be. For some, it might be a very difficult story. For some, it may be a story of how they overcome the challenge or the threat, or even a rebirth. It could be all sorts of stories. Just a little bit about why it's important. And the main reason for why stories are important because they activate multiple parts of our brain. They activate both the visual side of us because we start to imagine ourselves in that story when we listen to it. It activates our listening, the audio side, and also the kinesthetic, which is how we move or at least understand movement in our life or in the life of the storyteller. All of that actually makes stories a lot easier to remember. And especially when you compare them to cold hard data, which is just what I used to call it as before storytelling. How many of you can actually remember numbers, just like random numbers that are facts? And how many of you can remember a story told about a fact? Just as a way to see how powerful a story can be. Good stories always create connections and empathy between people. That's really important because a story really is a personal story. They also help you connect with some new ideas. A story about a new idea is much more powerful than a list of bullet points about that new idea. You can teach or learn something, you can reassure people, you can influence, you can inspire people through stories. And because they are so memorable, they will have a longer lasting impact. So hopefully that gives you the motivation to try and play with storytelling in your practice. Let's talk about the impact of those stories that we tell before we shift to our stories and the story that we are currently living. So the impact is both on the storyteller as well as on the listener. Specifically on the storyteller, every time you tell a story, you relive that experience. And that's important because it gives you a sense of achievement, of confidence, of shift from where you were to where you are now. It activates both the right and the left side of the brain, and I put them in quotation marks because there isn't really a right and a left. It's more different types of sides of the brain, but to generalize and to simplify, we call it the right and the left. The right is the more creative side of the brain, the left is the more logical side of the brain. It helps the storyteller understand better their values, what matters to them, where do they gain their energy, their motivation. And by telling stories, we start to understand what sort of patterns appear in our lives. And that helps us make sense of the reality. On the listener side, the moment you listen to a good story, you really feel a deep connection to both the experience as well as the person who's telling the story. It helps you generate your own emotion and to notice the emotion of the storyteller. And it gives you a real glimpse into life situations, struggles, values of the storyteller. And through that glimpse, you are able to connect with your own story, your own situations and struggles. It works particularly well on a listener if they can see themselves as the hero of that story. Of course, the story is about another hero, but if they can place themselves and recognize some of that story in their own life, that would make the storytelling even stronger. Of course, it helps them develop ideas, thoughts, opinions, and if they start to listen and engage with that story on the longer term, they can start to co-create a new reality together with the storyteller. So, let's talk about the moment, our reality right now. And that's split in my mind to two types of reality. So let's talk with the earlier story of the lockdown period. I'm sure you all are familiar and probably bored of stories about COVID-19. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but these images represent the stories we've kept hearing throughout the lockdown period. Stories about the NHS, story about the medical emergency, the impact of corona, curves that need to be flattened, and then, of course, the impact on our cities, on our businesses, the fact that we need to stay at home, the cities were empty, businesses were shut. All of these stories were going on and on and on in the last few months. And some promising stories as well in the background, slightly less prominent, about possible medications and possible vaccination that might be developed and is being developed. These are the overall stories all of us have been exposed and probably overexposed in that period. Now, on top of that, each and every one of us had a personal story of their own journey and own experiences. For some of us, the lockdown was easy. We stayed at home, we didn't have to work, everything was going on. We didn't get exposed to the disease or impacted by it. And for many of us, the reality was a lot more difficult. Whether we were exposed to the virus or know someone close to us who was exposed to it and impacted by it, whether it affected what we do, our income and our practices, for many of us, there will be that story as well. So we all have a flavor of the overall story with our own experiences in it. That was the earlier story, and now we go to the current story. And there is sort of the light at the end of the COVID-19 tunnel. Of course, we keep hearing about social distancing, and every now and again we hear about people not really paying attention to that, going to the beaches and staying in the parks, and also some promising news about soon we'll be able to go on holidays as we used to. All of that is going on as an overall story, and of course there are many aspects to it. The story of vaccination and medication is still going on, and some of the stories from the lockdown periods are still going on today. And even now, many of us, of course, have their personal stories. And those personal stories are different now. They're more focused on our first new experiences in this new great world of post-lockdown and reopening. So, of course, some of us have exciting new ways of doing things. Some of us are still a bit scared and worried about the future. All of that is part of our individual stories that are impacted and continues to evolve as we find our way in this new world. So this was just the overall stories and a little bit of awareness of the fact that we both have personal stories as well as are greatly impacted by overall big stories around us. Let's talk about the stories of reopening our practices, because that's when we start to transition from generally storytelling and understanding how it works to how is it going to impact our lives, our practices, reopening and really reopening. And I'd like to start this part of the webinar by actually turning over to Anthony Josephson from Masker Josephson, who will be sharing his stories of reopening. I listened to his stories a couple of weeks ago, and I found it incredibly inspiring, actually, because it shows how Anthony was able to deal with all the challenges that COVID-19 threw his way, and yet come out with a much more inspirational way of practicing. So, Anthony, over to you.
Thanks, David. So my story begins in the same place as many people's story, and that goes all the way back to when the world was a very different place back in February 2020. I feel like I need some sort of nostalgic sparkling music going on in the background at this point. So back a few months ago, with the COVID-19 hitting the news, I was spreading sort of very slowly at this point, but it was changing the way that people felt about travel. It was changing the way that people felt about going out, shaking hands. And I, like many other practice owners or clinicians, started to bring in some measures long before the official lockdown actually started. Frames were being wiped down every time someone touched them, surfaces being cleaned more regularly, magazines, things like that being removed from the waiting rooms, offering early, late appointments to people who were older, higher risk, more vulnerable, or just simply more concerned about coming into contact with other people. Come the 23rd of March, a re-evaluation of things was to make it clear that a lot more needed doing than that. So lockdown for us at my practice, or at least what is now classed as the cessation of routine eye care, began on the 23rd of March, long before the official statements were issued by NHS England and by the College of Optometrists. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, they sort of got ahead of the game and gave us a good idea in terms of what was coming. Patients were advised from my practice that we'd be locking our doors, but someone would be there if they needed us. I was never going to abandon people who needed our services. Now, of course, there's a degree of business as far as that's concerned. I would hate to think that somebody who's been coming to this practice for years and years would find somewhere else to go to and then think, oh, this is nice, and never come back to us because they were there when they needed the most. So there was an element of that, but first and foremost, it seemed like the right thing to do. It seemed like the human thing to do, to be there if you can help people when they needed your help. What would I want to do if I was in their shoes? So calls came through to my mobile phone. We set up a business WhatsApp line that allowed people to get in touch any time of any day throughout the crisis. From a more personal rather than business point of view, COVID-19 and the pandemic that ensued was always going to be a more complicated thing. From a business point of view, it was always going to be a fairly immediate and drastic change, and we'll get to that moment. But I had some personal issues that I had to deal with as far as this was concerned. So I'm immunosuppressed. I've suffered with Crohn's disease for the last 17 years or so, since I was just about to turn 16. When the lockdown hit, I had a 9-month-old daughter at home. Unsurprisingly, she's now 12 months old. And I have two dogs. And one of the main circumstances for me getting my dogs was that they had access to a daycare, which allowed them to get their exercise and their entertainment when I was busy at work. My twin brother, who also suffers with Crohn's disease, suffers a lot more severely than I do, and he works as a hospital-based pharmacist at Salford Royal Hospital. He was told pretty much immediately he would not be working from within the hospital. He had to go home, he had to shield, had to keep safe. And I was told, on the other hand, that I could continue with work if I needed to. I'd stay at home if I could work from home. The same as many other people. Any symptoms, isolate, but otherwise just be sensible about things. At home, the classes and everything that we had my baby daughter enrolled in, they were all stopped. Our doggy daycare stopped. For my wife, the prospect of being trapped sort of all day and all night with the 3 of them in the house wasn't a particularly attractive one. But we had to do this because the most important thing was to keep ourselves safe, and not just us safe, but anybody that we may come into contact with, whether it's doing the grocery shopping or obviously from my point of view, the people that were coming in to see me in my clinic. The philosophy that I took and still do in the practice was treating everybody who came through the door as if they were actually carrying the virus with them, symptomatic or not. And by treating them that way, it gave us the best chances of keeping well. And that's the same attitude for home and for the practice. So originally, I was kind of hoping and aiming to work from home as much as possible with all the call forwarding and triaging people. But there's a variety of reasons as to why that didn't work. So I based myself in my practice 6 days a week and offered what is now obviously widely referred to as the urgent or essential eye care. And that meant that it was fairly easy to keep distance and keep things clean. There weren't many people that were coming in on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. It was predominantly admin, so there was very little contact. However, should the business ever return to anything that would be classed as sustainable, big changes clearly would need to happen, and planning and implementing those needed to start right away. So then we had to start thinking about what changes the business was going to be made. So as practitioners, business owners, optoms, dispensers, CLOs, anybody else who's sort of watching this, we're always thinking from a clinical point of view about the illustrious patient journey. But I honestly couldn't remember before I spoke to David a couple of weeks ago about the last time prior to all of this that I actually broke it all down so thoroughly. You know, whether it's the simple way that we phrase things or the gestures that we make, the actions we do, you know, things are constantly changing. They evolve, but normally they do this organically. They do it slowly over time. But this needed a lot more than that, and it needed to be done all at once and all fairly in quick succession. I had no idea whether we'd be back open in a month, 2 months, 6 months, 12 months. But what was apparent is that whenever that day came, things would need to be run very, very differently. So think about the steps for a moment in terms of this patient journey. The first step generally is that the patient will contact you through some form to book an appointment. The next step, more often than not, is when they actually enter the practice. They check in at reception, they take a seat in the waiting room. They'll be called in shortly for either pre-screening in the case of a full eye exam, or into the consultation room for whatever appointment they're there for. Following this, they go to the shop floor. Hopefully they want to spend lots of money, buy some nice expensive glasses. Otherwise, they just pay for their appointment, say goodbye, leave, and then wait until they next require our services. You know, it's simple. It's been done like that for years, but it's not good enough anymore. It's not the way that we should be operating now, nor is it the way that we really can operate to meet safety guidelines, but also just common courtesy and common sense. So changes needed to be made. And if you think about those steps, every single step needed to be intervened and operated in a different way. So straight away, all of our frames were removed off the shelf, ignoring the fact that you can clean them. If you can't see somebody touch it, you don't know what to clean. The safest way to make that is to manage things that come into contact with. I spent a couple of weeks almost immediately in lockdown sketching out designs for the shop floor. We had a big refit here only in September last year, so doing a major project was never plausible, but sketching out the designs to redesign it according to what was likely going to be the scenario at the end of it all. We had custom screens built around our dispensing stations, around the reception desk, in the waiting area. The waiting room was stripped of all but 2 pairs of chairs. We've got 2 consulting rooms. The chairs were 3 meters apart, or the pairs of chairs were 3 meters apart. Breath shields were added to any instrument that they could be, and obviously PPE, lots of PPE. That's a phrase or an acronym that I'm sure many of us are more than familiar with now. We decided we were going to measure people's temperatures before they came into the shop, regardless as to what they were coming in for and how long they were going to be staying. Hand sanitizer would be used, face coverings would be encouraged, though not enforced. Consultations were going to be stretched to about 50% longer than they would be beforehand. Pre-screening would be done by the optometrists to minimise contact between patients and multiple members of staff. And obviously, internationally, as far as every business is concerned, there's a massive push on contactless everything. So we invested in new phoropters. That obviously allows us to check the prescription, but this could be done from across the room rather than sitting next to people. We invested in new equipment, aids and tools from a dispensing point of view, which meant that glasses could be measured and dispensed from across the room. And all of that is basically just scraping the surface of what we needed and what we've done. Now, that all works for my practice. It might not work for every other practice. Everywhere and everyone works differently. If you've got a bigger store, you may not need as many screens as us. If you've got a less busy store, you may not need as much spacing as we've got. But it became apparent that that's what we needed to do to keep ourselves safe. As practices started to open, the definition of essential changed. We can thank Mr. Cummings for that. And finally, routine eye care was eventually going to start emerging, although obviously, as we've seen fairly recently, that's changed again in Leicester. I'm aware that it's obviously not launched again properly in Scotland and other parts of the UK, but certainly in England, routine care was resumed. We were given relatively loose guidelines as far as that. Certain things we had to implement before offering our services, but a lot of it was open to interpretation. And I was not happy to tell my patients or my staff or even my family, you know, we've done everything that we need to do. For me, anything short of, right, we've done absolutely everything that we can possibly do was not enough. I would hate to open my doors knowing that something could have been done better, but we hadn't done it. So what about the future? What now is that my practice is a small practice. We're a single independent practice. We rely very heavily on word of mouth recommendations, and that's always been the case, and it's always been critical to the growth of the business, and it is now more than ever before. Communication was vital throughout the crisis, letting people know that we were there if they needed us, but also giving them an update on our plans and reassuring them on what they're doing, so that if, and I guess more to the point, when they needed to come in, they would know that we'd be a safe place to visit. The effort for the correspondence didn't go unappreciated. We added in sketches of my designs. We put in photographs as the work was being carried out, photographs once the work had been finished. And more recently, we even added a little video and set up a YouTube channel just for the sake of it, to give people a small tour of the new look practice. So it was less intimidating when they came in and saw masks and visors and screens everywhere. The last few weeks, we've had quite a lot of people, certainly a disproportionately large amount of new patients that have come to see us, purely and simply because their friends or their family received our correspondence and they've liked what we've done, they've raved about what we've done. They may have come in already and seen what we've done, but either way, there's an overwhelming sense of safety and reassurance for people that know us or come and see us. As a business, we've been here for over 50 years and relied very much on people complementing our service, our eye care, our glasses, our sort of clinical expertise. But we've never really had to worry about being an unsafe space. We've never had to worry about going to see your dentist generally, your doctors, going to the supermarkets, going to the opticians, and actually worrying about whether it's safe or not to go there. But that's not the case now. You'll almost certainly look through every window of every shop that you go through and think, have they got the right screens? Have they got the right masks? Are they wearing gloves? Are they washing their hands? And that is the post-COVID world that we find ourselves in, certainly for the time being. So the most important thing to us is that people come in, get the service that they're used to getting, but above all, walk out thinking that all the measures that we put into place keep them, but also at the same time keep us safe. And that's the new world that we live in. We have to get used to, obviously, people walking out going, the eye test was great, service was great, but my word, did I feel safe when I was there, and they really are looking after me. And that's where we find ourselves now at the practice. We've no idea how long these things will go on for. We will not remove anything until it's completely safe to do so. Certainly some of the protocols will now be in place for the long term, but the story will continue. We're not at the end of this story yet. It will continue to evolve over the next weeks, months, and probably likely years as well. Thanks, David. Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Anthony. David, back over to yourself.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you, Anthony. Every time I hear your story, I get inspired as well. And I'm sure that everyone who listened to you this evening will remember that story or parts of it much more than if you actually gave them a list of bullet points of your best practice. They would actually remember your thought process, your journey, and what you actually implemented. And that's the power of stories. Now, you might sit there and think, well, who am I to tell a story? Other people have better stories. Everyone can do it better than me. But I want to reassure each and every one of you has a story that can be told and, in fact, should be told. Each of us has a story. Each of us experienced the lockdown and the reopening and continues to experience it and could tell a story about it. So let's start about reflecting about your stories. And I'm going to give you some of these questions more for your own reflections, because some of them may be very, very powerful for you to reflect on, to think about how can you tell your story. So what parts of Anthony's stories do you actually recognize from your own context? Maybe you too had to go through similar challenges and figure out your own solutions. What stories do you have about reopening? And are they particularly inspiring, exciting, hopeful? Or do they have an element of despair in them? And think about the story and how you tell that story. If you have staff or colleagues working for you or with you in the practice, what are their stories? Because the more you can weave through a story of that practice by everyone, and they all share that story, the better. And then you have to pay attention also to what stories your potential customers will have about their first visit. Are they going to be, can't wait to change their lenses or glasses or get better eyesight? Or there's a story of fear and concern. All of the stories you have to consider as well. But most of all, which story would you really like to tell? Because each one of you had a personal story. And which one of your stories actually must be told, because it's really valuable. These are questions for reflections. I'm not necessarily expecting you to straight away have the answers for that, but I'm sure they already triggered some thoughts in your mind. So let's talk very briefly about how to craft great stories, stories that make a difference, stories that engage, that create confidence. I'll start by some of the key elements and then give you an example from a story we all know, and then think about how to apply it to real reality. So great stories have some sort of a pattern that we can recognize. And the pattern can be there was a threat or a monster, someone overcome it, and then they live a great life. That could be a pattern, or there may be another pattern. But the more we recognize the pattern, we can actually connect with it from our own life or from stories we've already heard in the past. But in order to be engaging, of course, it would be nice if the story has some novelty, some uniqueness, some surprise element to it. Many stories have a clear beginning, middle, and end. And the more authentic, the more personal a story is, the better. Because it becomes your story, and how you tell it is actually very different than if you just recite a corporate story. So taking it to a story many of us, if not all of us, know, the story of Cinderella. I'm just showing you how the story builds. There's the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning is Cinderella, of course, lives with her wicked stepmothers and stepsisters, and she is very much hoping for a better life. The middle bit, she goes to the, she meets her fairy godmother, and she has Prince Charming, of course, at the ball, and then she meets one of her class slippers behind. And finally, of course, Prince Charming finds that class shoe and finds Cinderella, and they live happily ever after. It shows you how the story builds from a poor background, very tough background, to some sort of development and plot that is interesting, that is exciting, all of us, and then finally the happy end of that story. That is a very simple structure, but it's quite consistent. If you think of many of the stories you know, you will see that that pattern repeats itself. So let's try to create a template for that might be useful to you. And the template might be something like this. And again, you will need to find your own way of telling that story. But I wanted to break that journey for you as a story so that you can see. You can talk about how it all started for you, what happened for you personally in your practice, in your life, and how COVID-19 introduced some challenges. Then you had the opportunity to reflect how you do things and what needs to change and how the new world might look like, which is the middle. And of course, there's a second part to that middle in our story because many of us open for urgent care, emergency care earlier on, and then open that fully. So there is the partial reopening, which actually enables you to test in a safe environment and with low numbers of visitors what you implemented and continue to improve it. And finally, the end, where you now know that things work well, you can review, you can adjust, and you can really feel confident about what you've implemented and able to provide the service that was always important for you. Optimal eyesight, great service, good value. These are all things that were important to you before COVID-19 and are still important. So that's really a very, very simplified template, but I wanted you to see that you can actually create a formula from which you can create your own personal story. How to become a great storyteller? Some of these tips, you need to know who you're telling that story, and you might have different stories for different targets. All of them should be authentic and personal, but they might show different parts of your story as you think that is relevant, whatever is relevant to your target. There should be some facts, there should be some characters and context. Now that, and after you have that story, make sure you practice it. Practice it on your family, on your friends. Practice and practice and practice, because the more you practice, the more you see which part of your stories work, they create some response, some engagement, some laughter, eye contact. These are good signs. Of course, if you notice that the person who's listening to your story is really disengaged, is trying to move on, then you know that something needs to change, and you can consider what to change. It might be your pace, your tone, your details, or any other element of that story. And when all of that is done, of course, share your story as much as wide as possible. Just final bit about how to tell your story. There are many, many online and offline options. Social media was covered by Dan Owens, but in my view, you can do that both online and offline, including the story sharing with the people that actually come to your practice. And keep your eye open to see which parts of those stories continue to engage people, which parts of the stories people respond to. And it might be simple as really connecting with them eyesight, or really saying, confirming to you that what they heard you say mattered to them. There are many, many ways of telling it, and you can find whatever works for you. And also think about the best time, the best opportunity in your context. Is it before they arrive? Is it when they call to book an appointment? Or is it when they're actually having their eyesight tested? There are many opportunities where you can tell that story. And I think never ever underestimate the power of one-on-one storytelling. It came also in Anthony's stories of how people reacted to stories they heard from other people, not directly just from the practice. I want to leave you with, I know that we are getting to the end of this webinar. I'd like to leave you with some final inspiration. I find this quotes really inspirational. J.K. Rowling, she's a great storyteller, as we all know. There's always room for a story that can transport people to another place. And even the second quote, I think, is incredibly powerful. It shows you the value of storytelling to fight off any challenge we have, illnesses, death, and any other challenge. Thank you. Over to you, really. I'd love to hear what you found interesting, useful, inspiring. I know we have very little time left for questions, but I will answer any questions you have and also follow up with other answers. And my contact details are here. I consider it not the end of this journey, but really the beginning of the journey. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David, and thank you, Anthony. If you want to come back on camera as well, Anthony, we do have a few questions from the audience. First one that came through, actually. I don't know if it's possibly aimed towards Anthony more than David, but I'm sure I'll get both of your views on this. Do you feel that there's value in shouting about the challenges faced in changing, as well as being proud about what we've had to adopt for the safety of our patients?
Okay, I'll go first on that one. I think it's always good to tell people what you're doing and why you're doing it, but as long as it doesn't come across in a negative way. Nobody likes a whinger, nobody likes a moaner, and if you're there going, oh, we've had to deal with this, business is really difficult, so we've had no choice, or the NHS didn't give us enough time, or the college didn't give us enough of this, or they're not paying us enough to do this, or they're not paying us enough to do that. No one cares about that. No one's going to sympathise for the issues that you've got. But what they want to know is they want to know that there's a positive reason behind you're doing it. So rather than we were really struggling with this, so we had to do this, I think it's better if you phrase the message of, right, we've had to implement the following changes in order to keep you safe, keep you happy, keep you healthy. That's a much nicer message than we're doing it for. Because if we don't, it's going to be bad. We're doing it because by doing it, it's going to be good.
Excellent, thank you. David, have you got a slant on that as well?
Yeah, I would say absolutely it's important. And the reason it's important, it provides a context. Without that, people don't necessarily understand why you've done what you've done. So talking a little bit about what the challenge that you were trying to solve is important. You don't need to dwell on it, but it's important to tell it, because otherwise the solutions that are presented and are celebrated in your story might be a little bit out of context.
Superb, thank you. Next question was, what do you think of the value of testimonials to make people listen to the story? I think probably particularly valid to the current situation? So your patient testimonials, are they a plus or an extra? Okay, Anthony, if you go first.
I mean, testimonials are always great, but if you're raving about your own business, you're hardly going to do a screenshot of a negative review, are you? So testimonials always have to be taken with a pinch of salt. You could go, we've seen 1,000 people, but here's the one person that was really pleased with what we've done. So I think it's more about again, letting people know why you're doing things and how, and trying to create a parallel between people that might be looking at your website, at your social media, and people who have commented on things. So if somebody goes, I was really worried about coming to get my eyes tested. I've been isolating for 4 months and I've not left the house, but I went and had my eyes tested and everything felt lovely and safe. Then a testimonial, something along those lines, is really useful, because there's bound to be other people that read that are in the same situation. I think this sort of marries up with David's seeing yourself as the hero sort of thing, whereby if people can relate to the testimonial that you're referencing, yeah, it's good. But if it's something that's just a testimonial of, I went, had an eye test, got a great pair of glasses, it's not quite as relatable, and therefore it's not as useful.
Great. David?
Great, I totally agree with Anthony. I would say use with caution, use when it actually adds more flavor to a story, when it actually helps someone transport themselves even better and even deeper to the story, but not necessarily use at all times. I think one great way of using testimonials is actually to ask people to share their views with their friends and their family in a more informal way, rather than quote them on a website or on a formal communication, because that's a nice way of getting their story to help you.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. Next question sort of relates a little bit to methods of communicating. So what do you feel is the most effective way of telling your story in the current environment to our customers? Social media, phone, obviously face-to-face where can?
I think it depends on what your target demographic is. It is that we do a reasonable amount on social media, but I'm absolutely convinced that the vast majority of stuff we put on social media gets massively missed by the vast majority of the demographic that would come and see us in the first place. But it still appeals to certain people, and it still catches the odd person that you wouldn't normally catch. And obviously cost has to come into it. It is that at the start of lockdown, we sent a message out through letter, text and email to sort of everybody on our books. But the letter and the text basically suggested that if they wanted regular updates, to provide us with an email address to do that, because we weren't going to be sending out 10,000 texts and 10,000 letters every week. But sending out 10,000 emails every week is free and easy to do. So you can argue that phone calls are probably more direct and probably more effective, but obviously no one's going to be making 10,000 phone calls every week, not if you've got most of your staff on furlough. And so texts again are short, sweet, they can be quite effective. But then we've done things before where we've sent text messages out which contain a link to a page on our website, and we've sent 4,000 text messages out, and then when we've checked the data, 15 people maybe have clicked on the link. So those texts would have cost us sort of £1,200 or so for the whole package. It's not always worth it, but emails are good. If you send enough emails, chances are someone will read one of them. But then there's the fine line between sending the right amount and sending too many.
Sure. Thank you.
From my point of view, I would say it's a combination of two things. First of all, your target, as Anthony mentioned, who is your target market, for example, and people that would come to your practice? Are they young people that would engage with, for example, social media, or are they more aged and want to engage with that? I would say the other side of this to consider is which medium you feel most comfortable with, because that would help you tell the story in the most effective way. If you love posting things on Instagram or on YouTube, go for it, do it, because your energy, your internal motivation of doing that and excitement of doing it would actually show up in that medium. If it's not something that you enjoy and like doing, think more about the informal way of storytelling, just in the practice or any other way that works for you, and that you feel comfortable and actually enjoy it.
Yeah, superb, good. Well, thank you very much. There was one other point, not so much a question as a statement, aimed at Anthony. Said, loved your story. Like you, never really thought of the patient journey as much as I do now. And I think it might be something that will be done regularly. So thank you both so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to do a short poll before closing, which is just our feedback. So if I can ask you to answering the questions on the poll. There are 7 down, so if you scroll down through there, and it's just so that we can create our feedback and react accordingly. These things are done clearly, obviously, for yourselves. It'd be great to find out what you would like to hear from us next about. So thank you both very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Anthony. I'm just going to pop up the screen as well about our CET presentations just while that poll is going on. So thank you both very much, and good night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Keep well.
Bye-bye.